Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Watercolor Ohio 2022. This exhibition is produced and circulated by the Ohio Watercolor Society. And today we're thrilled to hear from Carol Stevens, an artist that's a part of this show. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so please feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them during the Q&A portion of the hour. Next, live captioning is available, and you can access that by clicking on the closed caption icon and selecting Show Subtitles. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there might be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. And lastly, to get everyone comfortable, if you could pop into that chat, say hello and let us know where you're tuning in from, that would be fantastic. All right, thanks everyone. Now to you, Carol.
Thank you, Kat, and good afternoon to everyone. And I'd like to thank the Ohio Arts Council for inviting me here today to share my love of art with you. I was born in Lorain, Ohio. Much later on, moved to Norwalk, Ohio. Now I live in Medina. But as a child in Lorain, I had two passions. And of course, one was art. And I'm so happy to share it with you today. It all began when I was about 8 years old in the arrival of the television set to our home. It was a new advance that came to American homes at the time. And I was truly excited to see cartoons and live dancing and movies. But the best thing I was able to find was a program by John Nagy. This was a drawing instruction program in which he took very simple geometric shapes, cubes, cylinders, and cones, and with careful observation, drew them into wonderful drawings, very complex drawings of sometimes still lifes, landscapes, and even animals. I could follow along with him step by step all through his television program, his weekly television program, and later on his book. And I was able to draw anything that he could draw. And he was amazing at the time. He taught my 8-year-old eyes how to observe and find all those same geometric shapes all around me, so I could draw anything I saw. It was like having a superpower. My kitchen table became a cube. So I continued to draw along with John until when I was about 12 years old. My mother bought me a paint by number oil kit, which were very popular at the time. It was a landscape, and so as I opened it up, there was a pre-drawn landscape brushes, a brush, I think, in multiple colors. I was started to fill in the sky of the landscape, and I was being very careful to fill in the outlines with the prescribed color. So as I moved throughout the sky, I began to really look at it and decided something was really wrong with the sky. I was staying right inside the lines. So what the sky looked like was not a fuzzy sky, but a pile of rocks. So this was my first encounter with hard and soft edges. We all know clouds are fuzzy. So since my sky didn't look right, I thought, well, I could go outside the lines. But then I decided that I found a Christmas card that I liked much better. So I was able to cover over the entire landscape with the Christmas card picture. And because of John's lessons on perspective and shading and geometric shapes, I was able to accomplish this painting when I was 12. So I credit John with my love of art and also my love of teaching. Okay, I mentioned I had two passions. The other passion, oh, maybe I didn't mention that. I had two passions when I was a child. One was art, the other was roller skating. This is another one I discovered at the age of 12. And I was able to skate almost every day of the week until I graduated from Lorain High School. So my childhood was filled with drawing and roller skating. Ultimately, I went to Bowling Green State University as an art major. This is a watercolor I did there. Watercolor was a required class. And at the time, we were to take the paper soak it in a tub of water, lay it out on a board, and stick it down with brown paper tape all around the outside. Then the paper was supposed to dry and you would have a perfectly flat surface to paint on. Well, this never worked for me. My paintings always rumpled up. So my solution was to draw with ink and then with as little water and as little color as possible, fill in the shapes. So this is what I thought watercolor was, and it wasn't my favorite subject at the time. My favorite subject was life drawing. And in life drawing, the first few minutes, we had 3-minute poses and 5-minute poses just for warm up. And what I liked the most about that was I had discovered contour lines, which by just simply varying the pressure of my pencil, I could achieve a lot of expressiveness in the lines. The figures themselves, rather than figures, look more like flat shapes to me. So flat shapes and contour lines have always, from this beginning, been very prevalent in my work. I did go on to get a teaching degree, and I did teach in Lorain City Schools for 5 years until my son was born. I taught elementary and junior high school. Then there was a long period of family and working on houses and 2 Victorian old houses and not much art. But eventually, admiring the Victorian houses and the leaded glass, I chose to take a class in leaded glass. And the amazing thing to me as I was making this program up is realizing in the leaded glass itself, the similarities there with my life drawings. Here again, you have the flat shapes. You cut the shapes out of glass. They're a flat piece of glass. For instance, like the white opaques of the lilies, there are a number of just flat shapes there. Then there is the boldness of the lines when you cut the flat shapes out and then you lay them on the table and you fit them together like a puzzle. Then you fasten them together by leading, and in this case, copper foiling. So you have heavy, dark, bold lines, and there's a little variety in size. But the similarity of the flat shapes and the contour lines reminded me very much of my love of life drawing and why possibly I liked leaded glass. As I said, you build these by laying them on a table and fitting them together and then soldering them. The amazing thing is while you're doing this, you don't exactly know what it's going to look like. You have been able to hold the various pieces of glass to the light and look at through them, but to imagine them all put together, you just have to use your imagination. So eventually when you can slide that glass off the table and hold it up to the light, it's like a magical moment. The whole thing comes to life and the colors shine through, and you realize the beauty of the transparency and the contrast of the transparency and the opaque glass. Finally, in about 1990, I was able to watercolor. I selected watercolor. It seemed the easiest thing to start with. Again, watercolor is a transparent paint, and painting these are African violets that were my mother's. I was experimenting with the different colors of paint, the different properties of the colors of paint. I was taking books out of the library for suggestions, and you can see I never did master paper stretching. But the other thing that was amazing to me is watercolor is transparent and the paper is white. And so the idea of to light up the watercolor, the transparent watercolor, you need the white paper behind it, just as exactly as the leaded glass. The leaded glass didn't light up because it was transparent until I put light behind it. So in the case of watercolor, very reliant on keeping the white of the paper behind it because the watercolors are transparent. And if you're an authentic, totally transparent watercolor artist, you don't use white paint. So you really have to know where your white shapes are going to be so you can preserve them and where your light shapes are going to be. So you always start off with very light colors, white or light colors, and then move into darker colors. I was fortunate to find a watercolor artist in Medina, Ohio named Fred Graff. Fred Graff is an Ohio watercolor artist. He at the time back then was teaching high school, but he had summer workshops in Medina, and they were plein air, which means you could paint outside and choose any subject that you wanted. So Fred is a master of negative painting, which is a very necessary skill if you're doing totally transparent watercolor. Again, there's no white paint, so you start with your lightest shapes or figures. And in this case, it's the scarecrow. So I started with him. He's very light. He's the positive figure. And then the shapes behind him, the dark green, are the negative shapes. So it's very important to be able to paint negative shapes to see the background and darken them so that your subject matter comes forward. So I learned this after my 1 week of going back and forth from Lorraine to Medina, and I very much admire Fred's teaching skills. Then I was able to discover another class, this time in Bay Village. This is taught by Fred Leach, what's now known as Bay Arts. Fred was a graphic designer, which means he used opaque. Opaque paint was part of his technique. He wasn't a totally transparent painter. So this opened a door for me because I'm not very good at planning. When I do plan something, it never comes out that way anyway. So I have to leave a lot of doors open for me to move on to another design or another plan. So opaque paint was a welcome addition. And in this case, these are Fred's cornstalks. When Fred taught a class, whatever Fred painted, you painted. So this was a version of cornstalks where you poured masking fluid throughout the center. Masking fluid protects the white of the paper. Then you are able to paint over that with all the darks that you want. Later on, you can rub off the masking fluid, exposing the pure white paper again. So then you can go back to adding your lights. This was another very useful technique. Eventually, I sent a few paintings to an art show in Oberlin at the Firelands Association of Visual Arts, otherwise known as FAVA. And I was quite surprised when they asked me to teach beginning watercolor, because I thought, well, I'm just learning beginning watercolor. But then on the other hand, I am a teacher. So I chose to go ahead and teach the classes. I had a wonderful group of ladies, and they challenged me. We were learning the basics, of course, but along the way, they would come up with all kinds of questions. And for instance, this one was, okay, we're not supposed to use white paint if we're doing totally transparent. But also all the books say you're not allowed to use black paint. So how are we going to paint a night scene, or can you paint a night scene? So I would go home and research and observe, just like John Nagy had told me, look at the shadows, look at the moon when it comes out at night. Are there shadows? How does the light look when it's coming out of a window, and so on. So I went ahead, and this was the painting I did for research for that class, so that the next week when I got there, I had a lesson all prepared for them on mixing darks with watercolor, not using black paint, but instead mixing things like one example is phthalo green and permanent magenta will give you a really nice dark color. So we spent the lesson mixing dark colors. The next week, they asked about, we were talking about the, let me go fix that, the properties of different watercolors. There are, some of them are perfectly transparent. Some of them are granular. So even though they're all transparent, they still behave in different ways. I was also surprised to find that there was different shades of red, so many different shades of red, so many different shades of blue, and so on. So this lesson was on granulating colors. And it's a triad of Indian red, cerulean blue, and yellow ochre. Okay, so I experimented with that and challenged them to do that also. Okay, the next painting is Abby and Isaiah. They asked me, how do you make a painting of a person or a figure? And I thought, I found a book that's had the suggestion of finding a photograph that was very strong sunlight and shadow, so that if you could just paint the shadow shapes, the figure would appear. So I thought that was an interesting idea or way to paint, as opposed to learning how to draw faces and figures and everything that we weren't going to do at that time. So I had this picture of Abby and the cat and looked at the shadows in her hair and on her face and the shadows in her shirt and primarily painted those. It's not particularly a likeness of her, but it is a figure and an animal, and the shadows are a very important part of it. Okay, then you always get the question of, oh, I just got a new sofa and I need to paint something to go with it. So it's gray and it has pink in it, which led me to another perfect lesson on the color wheel, complementary colors. There's green and there's red, and they're complements. And when you mix them together, they neutralize each other into gray. So if you have a gray sofa and you want some very muted colors to go with it, but a little extra, this would be the color combination to use. Now, I very much admired my classes with these ladies in teaching transparent watercolor, but I was truly excited to discover this book. This was a real turning point in my time. Techniques for Releasing the Creative Spirit by Marilyn Huey Phyllis. Marilyn was the president of Ohio Watercolor at the time. And of course, by now, both Fred Graff and Fred Leach were Ohio watercolor artists. I decided there'd be time for me to join Ohio Watercolor Society. Her book was different than all of the other books I had gotten out of the library. Her book was more experimental. I very much admired her process. She became my mentor. She was a kindred spirit and a treasured friend. I met her in person at the 1993 OWS seminar, which was the first one. She arranged these seminars and they were amazing. They were 3-day events where there were a huge variety of demos and critiques and one-day workshops, lectures and artists. It was so exhilarating to hear so many ideas, so many different styles, so many different techniques, so many different ways of just thinking about art. They were really varied people. Marilyn was an analytical chemist, and a very experimental artist. So she was very inspiring. In her book, she suggested blob paintings. This is what she called them, blob paintings. And of course, there was no stretching. She didn't mention anything about stretching the paper, which was right off the bat a good thing. But she said, just take a paper and just drop some water on it and then a little color and watch it run. Maybe you can tip it and turn it and see what you get. When it's dry, you were to look at your blob and see if you see anything in it that you might want to add to. You could find possibly flowers, you might find birds, you might find just a basic design that you wanted to add onto the design with nothing recognizable in it. This was my first attempt at a blob, and I was truly amazed to find a whole family. A mother with a baby, a little boy and girl, and the little girl has a doll. And with just a little bit of negative painting, I was able to find these figures in this blob painting. The little boy and little girl look very much like, suspiciously like my children when they were younger. I really admired the transparent look of watercolor. And this was a fun way to even be able to experiment with the transparent color. This painting is called Backyard Canal. And this was another Ohio watercolor workshop given by an artist, Gerald Brommer, who was also a high school art teacher. So it's wonderful to have a juror, and then that same juror each year at Ohio Watercolor gives the 1-week workshop that you can sign up for. And it's especially good when it's not only a great artist, but also a really good teacher. And everybody really enjoyed Gerald Brommer's workshop. It was on watercolor collage. So we started with a piece of watercolor paper, heavy, like a 300-pound watercolor paper. Lightly did a watercolor, suggestive watercolor, nothing detailed on that paper. Then we set about tearing little pieces of, we call it rice paper. He corrected us and said, no, it's called washi, which there are many different forms of Oriental kind of papers, and adhering them to the surface of this watercolor with thinned acrylic medium. So some parts it would make it a little less absorbent where you got a little too much acrylic medium, but that made it just an interesting surface to experiment with. Again, the word experiment. Maryland experiments, this is more experiments. So I was able to add little shapes and find little shapes to add, shapes to highlight. You can move the collage pieces around. So this was maybe another way to experiment to see, does the paper look better here? Or does it look better over there? You can make decisions as you're painting without planning everything ahead. Gerald Brommer also emphasized design, which again, every book that you get pretty much talks about design at the beginning. They talk about the elements of art and the principles and design formats. But I hadn't thought too much about it until he really pointed this out. This painting is a cruciform, or he also calls it a high horizon, because the line across the top, the shoreline, is the horizontal bar. And then there's a vertical coming down from the palm trees, down through the flowers, down through the bigger flowers, down right off the bottom with some drips off the bottom. So this makes a cross-shaped form. Paintings should have some sort of structure, some sort of design, some plan that you can build on, or a structure. So cruciform is probably the easiest one, the most obvious one. And so from this point on, I decided to experiment with various design formats. So he opened the door to actual texture, because the rice papers you could actually feel with your hand and not just see them. And also non-objective design. In this case, there's recognizable forms in this, but you could also use these structure and design for making non-objective work. Okay, these are some of my materials for the collage, and the thin washi that Gerald Brommer used has turned into, in this case, if you can see, torn watercolor papers, 140-pound watercolor papers that are paintings that were unsuccessful. I tore them into pieces, all sorts of other collage papers that are hand decorated and experimental, all a multitude of acrylic products. Acrylics are water-based media. In Ohio Watercolor, we are allowed to use any water-soluble material or paint except water-based oils. So you can see just some of the ones I have used here. There's gels, there's gessos, there's liquid paints, there's tube paints. Alcohol is used to lift acrylic paints. I use brushes, scrapers, rollers, stamps, scrapers, water-soluble graphite, water-soluble chalks. Anything I lay my hands on can get into my mixed media acrylic experimentations. In the very center, you see some map paper. This was part of a painting that I have now torn in half and probably will try and build something on. One of the earliest watercolor shows I went to, I encountered Don Getz, who was the president, the very first president of Ohio Watercolor Society. And he explained that I could not use newspaper because it wasn't hand generated. I'd have to get out a two-haired brush and paint my own newspaper. So from that point on, I realized I couldn't use anything that wasn't made exactly entirely by me. So his technique was that he introduced one time at an Ohio watercolor seminar was to take a piece of Aquarius paper, put a puddle of acrylic paint in the center, take a scratchy brush and spread it all over the paper, and then simply paint with your transparent watercolors. Now that made the paper non-absorbent and kind of glossy. So this was a fun experiment because I could lift some parts and add more other parts. The first painting I ever got into Ohio watercolor, I was fortunate to get in, was this painting called Aunt Clara. And it was that very technique that Don Getz had taught. Acrylic underneath the paint that I could move around and lift and draw on. So that was another welcome experiment. Okay, by now you've realized I really like to experiment, and especially with design formats. I don't necessarily like to have a subject. To me, that's oftentimes limiting. I like to work non-objectively so that my subjects are color, shape, line, texture, value. These are the elements of art. And I just like to take those things and arrange them into compositions without worrying about going to the library and looking up zebras to see how many stripes they have, or some other scientific fact that if you're doing realistic painting, you always have to get those things right. So this way I just was free to just play and experiment. So lots of times people will say, well, if your painting is not objective, you can switch. What do I look for? If I'm not supposed to look for something realistic like a dog or a cat. And I tell people to just start by looking at a non-objective painting, look for the structure, because this is what I proceed here now to experiment with. This you can see is a cruciform. The strong verticals, I had a painting, of course, that I was on a board that I didn't like. So I put masking tape over the parts that I did like, and then poured gesso over that and wiped it and sprayed it with alcohol and did all sorts of things with it. I tore up other watercolor papers and adhered them to the surface. And ultimately I felt a very strong cruciform shape or format. And again, I'm experimenting with different kinds of formats. So this one unfortunately does have a name because it did come out looking like an Arctic sunset. So, but it was meant to be non-objective. Next. Yep, tried that. There. Okay, this one is Ancient Spirits. And this one is, I would call it a horizontal. I was experimenting to see if I could have make a purely horizontal composition. There's dark horizontally across the top. Across the middle is the gold and oranges and yellows. And across the bottom is a band of cooler colors. Now, of course, there's some verticals in there. You need to have some variety and some contrast. So, but it's mainly, I would call this a horizontal painting. This painting is called Ancient Spirits, and it received the Don Dennis Award in 2006. The juror, Stephen Quiller, called it a very powerful painting. This next painting is called Tapestry. In this case, I was experimenting with a vertical format, which I took another old painting and had a bag of very heavily decorated collage strips, thin strips, which I tore into long, thin pieces and laid them vertically across the top of the painting. And so each of these were really decorated with stamping and scraping and crayons and so on. So it made the painting look like just a tapestry. a collection of pieces, but I felt it was a vertical composition. This next painting began as a rectangle that I was unhappy with. So I tore part of it off and was left with a square. As I worked on this painting, I've heard it described as frames within frames. I've heard it described as golden mean, which would be dividing in thirds horizontally and dividing in thirds vertically, which makes it kind of like a tic-tac-toe pattern. But in the meantime, as I was working on this painting, I had this nice peach up at the top, peach color, and peach color down at the bottom, and I wanted some more peach. So part of the part that I tore off had that color exactly that I wanted. So I tore it off and adhered it to this painting. So it's a painting within a painting. This painting is a diagonal composition. And I arrived at it with masking tape also, masking over parts of an old painting that I wanted to keep the brightest colors, pouring gesso, then over top of that, maybe grading some pastel color in to give the gesso some color, because the gesso was white, scraping and scratching and doing different things to the surface until I was happy. It felt like it was called Blown Away, and it felt like whatever was underneath was truly blown away. This painting is called Plateaus, and you can see some of my stamping on this one. This one, again, by now, hopefully you recognize the cruciform. It's got a strong horizontal and strong verticals. So this painting received the Award of Excellence in 2012 from Mark Mahaffey right there at the Rife Gallery. And he said at the time, this was a wonderful painting. He gave it an award. However, if he were judging a national contest and was sitting just having slides flashing in front of him for a few seconds, he probably would miss it because it did not have a strong black and white or strong value pattern. So if I wanted to enter national shows with slides that they only have a few seconds to look at, I would need to have stronger value pattern, which I thought was a very interesting and very helpful comment. This painting is called Glass Ceiling. And when I first started with Ohio Watercolor, I was so attracted to all the experimentation that was going on. The earlier artists, the Marilyn Phyllis, Fred Leach, and Don Dennis were all experimenting. So I decided to try something that would involve as many experiments as I possibly could. As I said, all water soluble media is permitted, and you're allowed to paint on any surface that supports the paint. So one of the original members, Fred Leach, always said in his classes, he painted 3 ways. He painted for American greeting cards. He'd have to paint flowers or whatever they were requiring him. He painted for his classes, the cornstalks, the sugaring off, very popular paintings that we enjoyed watching him paint. And then he sold those paintings and they're very popular. So he painted to sell. The 3rd way he painted was for Ohio Watercolor Society, which was a place that he could explore freely and express himself entirely with various water media. So I thought I tried in this painting to accomplish as many different types of water media in different kinds of paper. They're all woven together. It was a massive thing. It weighed 20 pounds. So I decided that was enough of this, but it was a lot of fun to experiment with all the different methods of water media and on different surfaces. The water, the seminars had stopped in 2010. Marilyn had arranged 7 of them, but she didn't let that stop her entirely. She lived in Wheeling, West Virginia, and discovered on a nearby hilltop Sands Crest, which was a retreat center. And she began having twice a year retreats, celebrating the creative spirit, and art and creativity retreat. She was always encouraging creativity. She would hold these retreats, and they were very small and intimate, and she wouldn't demonstrate or give instructions, simply inspiration, encouragement, and each person was able to select whatever medium, whatever they wanted to do, whatever method they wanted to work in. It's a very pleasant, relaxing, totally peaceful place. It's a wonderful space that I'm fortunate enough now to mentor in her absence, and I'm quite honored to do that. I can't replace Marilyn, but we have her spirit there with us all the time. This painting is called Ghost Ponies. And in thinking about Marilyn and her blob paintings, this still happens once in a while when I'm painting with my experimental acrylics. I was working on a horizontal acrylic painting with my usual finding some collage pieces, gluing them down. And in this case, it was a Kentucky Derby ticket, which I knew would get buried because Don Getz would be unhappy if it showed. So it was well buried underneath paint, more collage papers. But as I added other torn papers to it and scraped through some of the gesso, and I would set it aside, and then I had some leftover blue paint I put across the bottom. Eventually I noticed horses running across the painting, and there was no way I was going to stop these horses. I just needed to add a few negative shapes, and there they were charging across the paper. It's like, well, I guess I'll have a horse painting. I don't know if it was the Kentucky Derby ticket or whatever it was, but I wasn't going to be able to deny those horses their painting. So Marilyn's blob paintings were ever present in my experiments. I have my own creative space. This is my studio here in Medina. Dan's put up wonderful lights. It's like turning the sunlight on. When I come down here, I can paint anytime, day or night, in any weather, doesn't matter what's going on. From the opposite direction, you can see I have too many books. Most of those books are signed by the workshop presenters, and they've become my friends. So as I'm painting down there, I can refer to them anytime, and it's like being surrounded by friends. I have little areas in my studio. I call them altars, for lack of a better word. And they're just simply mementos and happy memories that I like to surround myself with. Now and then my studio has visitors. The neighbors have chickens. They're not mine. Okay, we spend the winter in Florida 4 to 5 months. We have been doing that. And I only have a little room down there for a studio. So I couldn't take all my collage papers, all my acrylics, or the chickens or anything down there with me. So I just have this one room. I had to switch to a different method of painting, and I had discovered Yupo there. So Yupo is 20 by 26. It's a little smaller and simpler to work on, and less materials to go with it. So as I explored this Yupo, which is Yupo is non-absorbent plastic paper, not paper, just a plastic sheet, kind of like your kitchen counter. You can just take a sponge and wipe the paint all off of it. I could wipe with a wet sponge this painting right off down to the white of the Yupo. It makes it a very interesting surface to experiment with. So again, I experimented. I worked on lifting and wiping things and texturing and drawing with lines and water-soluble crayons. It's kind of an add and subtract sort of surface. Okay.
There.
This is Wish You Were Here, done with the same, more experiments with Yupo. It's a horizontal painting. The ladies across the center are the main part. They're the horizontal light part in the center. And again, more experimenting. This is abstract because you do recognize the figures. So, but then it's not realistic either. Everything has been flattened out. And so I'm still back with my favorite contour line drawings and flat figures. Okay, this is Scarab. This painting was my first entry into National Watercolor Society, and they accepted it, so I was very pleased. They also accepted my portfolio and voted me into signature membership at the same time. The painting was done right after I had taken a workshop with Mark Mahaffey up here in Ohio, and he had introduced me to using gouache. So not only could I experiment with lifting and adding paint, I could also layer paint. With the opaque gouache. So how do I work with UPO? I guess I skipped the slide.
Yeah.
Okay, I start off by making what I call it a mess. It's just simply as much paint as I can get on a piece of UPO paper. And in this case, one of the things that Mark Mahaffey did that I enjoyed, he would get so much paint on the paper and he'd make like a UPO sandwich another one on top. And then when you pull them apart, it leaves all sorts of little funny lines like this and bubbles and so on. So you just need to get enough paint on the paper and then you can start manipulating it. So this painting is a kind of like Marilyn's blob, maybe, I don't know, but I was able to get this painting from that one you just saw, the blob. I took and wiped away a lot of the paint and exposed a cruciform shape. I was doing this when I was at Sands Crest, and I was not wanting to take too much attention away, because when you're monitoring, you don't want to get too involved, because I want to make sure everyone else has what they needed. But this painting, the mess that you saw before this, was calling to me saying, you know, get some of this paint off. I need some attention. So I wiped away a lot of the paint, and then I took the painting home when I got back and laid it out, as I do often with a number of paintings, on the floor. And I'll choose one and start painting on it, and then another one will call to me. So I'll pick that one up and start painting on that. This one kept calling to me, telling me, you've got that white roller with that white gouache in it. I need some of that on these smeared marks that you have. So I would pick it up and put some gouache on some of the areas. Then it was asking me for the opaque turquoise. It had transparent turquoise. Now it needed some opaque turquoise. It kept talking to me. I don't know. I talked to my paintings, they talked to me. I answered them. Finally, it said to me, I'm done, I'm happy. So I was finally done, and it was happy. That painting was called Carousel. This is another one called Unwound. And this was, this one is called Unwound. And it has, it had another technique that Mark introduced to me with masking tape going across to, once your UPO is dry, you can masking tape over it and then lift the masking tape and the paint will be just fine underneath it. My only predicament is I had all the paint dry, the tape was blue tape, so I taped over all the places and made nice lines intersecting and I thought were interesting. The only problem is once I started to add opaque paint over that, I couldn't remember what was underneath the blue tape. So it made it a really challenging experiment. Next time I'm determined I'll find transparent tape. So I won't have that problem. Okay, this is North 40. This is a non-objective painting. This is the painting that's at the Rife right now. And if you look at it, like I said, it's non-objective, it's a cruciform. And you might look at it and say, well, I see some things in there that are recognizable. And if it's non-objective, that shouldn't happen. That's not the case either quite. When my doctors are in Norwalk and I live in Medina, so I go back and forth frequently. And I've done this for years. And each time, different weather, different time of day, different seasons, I observe the barns, the fields, the sky, the clouds. And these shapes or images they live in my head. So when I'm painting, sometimes they appear. Like when I'm driving back and forth and I'm seeing, or Dan is driving back and forth and I'm looking out the window, I see the shadows as shapes. I see the grasses as texture. I see the fences as lines. I see the seasons as color. I see the graffiti on the passing train in Wellington as pattern. So I see things and they appear in my painting that if you are from Ohio, when you see these things all the time too, you will recognize them. If you're from Florida, you'll look in there and won't be able to find any palm trees because that's what's familiar with you. So you see in a painting, even though it's not objective, you will still see familiar things if you live in that same area or you are familiar with those things. So this is why this painting means Ohio North 40 to me is a farm, because I feel those images. It may be something entirely different to you if you don't live in Ohio and you don't see these things. So there isn't one particular meaning to a non-objective painting. You won't always have to be able to figure out what was the artist talking about. You're thinking, which should be like, what do you see in it? What do you feel about it? And the very first thing that I think that you need to look for when you're looking at a non-objective painting is what is the structure and then what's built on it. So this painting won the Ohio Watercolor Sarah Cass Memorial Award, which I was honored to receive. It's hanging there at the Rife right now until October 7th. I also enjoy painting with a group of ladies, artist friends of mine here in the Medina area. And we're a small group of women, and we hope to use our visual art as our voice to express our views unique to women. And each year we choose a theme, and then we meet the following October to see how we've all interpreted it. Artists are teachers and historians. So it's quite joyful when we look to see what everyone else has come up with as an interpretation. The theme for this particular year, which was last year, was The Hill We Climb, which is the poem by Amanda Gorman. And so since our previous year was canceled because of COVID, we all had a lot of hills to climb. So this particular one is a UPO, and I think it most expresses, I called it suspended, because I feel during COVID, we were all suspended, wondering what's going to happen next. Will anything ever get back to normal? How long will this be? What's going to happen? And the composition is cantilever, which I've never done a cantilever before, but then I've never felt suspended before either. So it has a very strong anchor across the top, two very dark shapes, and a whole lot of activity going down the right side, which is enough to support the bright yellow shape on the left side. So it's just kind of hanging out there, which is the way I felt. And I believe also when you look at a painting, you need to look for structure, but you also need to look for meaning. And again, this is what it means to me because this is the year I painted it. Someone else might look at it in another part of the country or world at a different time or different year, and they will get a different feeling. So how you're feeling and thinking that day helps you come up with your meaning. And that is also what a juror looks for, is he looks for meaning, he or she looks for meaning, also looks for content. This can also be called content. And since you never know who a juror will be, you don't know what sort of content they're looking for. So in case you're wondering, my other passion was skating, and I was still able to compete in the early 2000s, and Dan and I now skate nearby at Brunswick Skate Station and in Lorraine Skate World, where there's a live organist still playing our tangos, waltzes, and foxtrots. I hope I've answered the how and why I paint experimentally and not objectively. It's playful, it's fresh, I can respond to today. I like to find structure and meaning. It's a puzzle. I love solving puzzles and mysteries. Some puzzles are easy, some are not. Some get buried several times over. Anytime you're looking at a non-objective painting like I make, please look for the structure. You can begin there and see where you go from there. I find this process very rewarding. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you, Carol. That was lovely. So, folks, if you need more Carol Stevens work, here are your ways that you can get in contact with her. This is recorded, so you'll be able to see it later too. So Carol, if you want to stop sharing, and I'll go ahead and spotlight you and me, and we'll take questions. And yeah, go from there. Here, spotlight you. All right. So I am curious, when you do quite a bit of collaging, and you talk about using old paintings. So I would love for you to chat about how you are able to identify when a piece becomes material to new piece. Like, when are you done? When has something lived its life in its form and now needs to be transformed? Yeah, chat about that a little bit.
Okay, what I have, if I'm painting on something and I'm working on it, and a multitude of things can happen. I either can't figure out what to do next with it, and it's just a mystery and I'm tired of it, or something happens and we go to Florida and it gets left behind. So I have a stack of things that are in progress. And if I'm going to try something like heavy collage, well, I'll look for the thickest, heaviest board and start with that. So it'll have to do with whatever works that way. But the group of ladies that I paint with right now, the subject that they've chosen for this year's theme is called Pentimento, which means exactly what I do all the time. Have a painting that I'm not happy with, or that I've learned something since then, or my opinions or insights have changed, or history has changed, and I need to use part of that, but update it more or less. And so this is kind of the meaning of pentimento, repenting and saying I'm going to fix something that I've made an error in before. So in this coming October, I'll be very curious to see what my artist friends have come up with, how they have interpreted the word pentimento. But they laughed because they said, well, you just do this all the time. Using pieces like the woven one, the glass ceiling, those were pieces of paintings that I was unhappy with, or they had just gotten partly done and I didn't have time to finish. And I don't like to throw anything away. But if I have leftover paint on a palette, I will look around to see what I have that I can put it on. The amazing thing is, without planning or pre-planning, sometimes just that intuition does the best thing. Across the horses, the ghost ponies, that blue paint, I had it left over. I had to put it on something, and there it was. And then in the end, it worked perfectly. So sometimes you really have to trust your intuition and just let it run.
That's great. Wonderful. We have a question. Your work with texture is so interesting. Have you explored sculpture or 3D forms? Do you see that being of interest in your artistic journey?
I don't think so. The glass ceiling was woven, and I think the limit for Ohio watercolor was 2.5 inches deep. So, and I pushed that to the limit. So it was interesting to have that texture. And I have just recently coming up with something possibly for pentimento, of taking one of the other ones that I did similar to that out of the frame, because I don't like the colors, and wrapping it around a cylinder of some sort. And I still have lots of those strips of paper. So that is right now on my mind, but other than that, I haven't thought about it.
All right. So share with us a day in the studio with you. How do you get into the studio every day? What time of day are you practicing in your studio? Is there something that opens up your day? Just give us a little sense of that experience.
When I come down these stairs over here and I turn on these lights, like I said, it's like turning on the sunshine. It's just pure joy in here. And I am surrounded by all my friends. I'm here by myself, but I'm with all my friends. So I enjoy that experience. I always start, it seems like, with cleaning, puttering around, straightening things out. I think artists are primarily organizers. We're always taking everything we see, feel, and hear and condensing it into, or distilling it into a work of art. And so I start off by cleaning my studio and putting things here and putting things away and putting out all of these things together over here. And pretty soon I find the paintings that I was working on are partly done. And something starts talking to me, and that's where I'll go. I have areas that are more for acrylics, areas that are more for UPO, areas more for drawing. So it's wonderful to have this big space that I can have all of these things open to me and move back and forth between them.
So it's any time of day that you don't have like a ritual that you adhere to?
No, no, no. Just when I see time that I won't be interrupted. Yeah, I look at my schedule, my week schedule, you know, skating is on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So, but no, you know, I can spend a whole entire day down here and be undisturbed. I really look forward to that. And I really make use of that. But I'm usually down here every day at some point.
I love that. So we've had a few lovely comments just saying that they really enjoyed your talk and, you know, picking out particular paintings that they really enjoy. But we have another question, which is,
Thank you.
what is one of the biggest lessons watercolor and specifically non-objective design has taught you?
To play. I always go back to the elementary school kids that I taught, and the joy of just playing without concerning yourself about what's going to end up. Just if you find a technique that you're doing or you're working with, or colors or whatever it is, and you're just playing with it, the joy is in the making of it. And it's fun to see something come out at the end, and especially if it comes out good and it is a puzzle. But just the fact that I can get down here and get my fingers into things and tear things and scribble on things, and it's just that joy that I have of that.
Lovely. I love that. Well, thank you again for joining us, everyone, for this artist talk by Carol Stevens. And thank you, Carol, for giving this great talk as a part of our programming for Watercolor Ohio 2022. I'd like to give a special thank you to all of the participating artists, as well as the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who supports the OAC, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.